Well, it's a real pleasure to come back to Queen's. In many ways, the saying to Peter, the gestation of all this research really started in Queen's, in that my PhD supervisor back in 2012 was Richard English. He was then briefly in, as you know, in St Andrews. And of course, the Viva then actually took place here in Belfast, because Keith Jeffrey was the external examiner but was unable to travel. But he was quite ill at the time, obviously, but he gave an incredibly forensic examination of the Viva, for which I will be forever grateful in terms of the advice that he passed on to me. And then people like Graham Walker, of course, who were key advisors in terms of the Scottish element of some of the research as well, and the links between Ulster, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. So I'm hugely grateful to Queen's and very honoured to be back here. So today, what I want to do is, first of all, I just briefly bring your attention to this quote. I'll start with an earlier conflict, because in terms of sometimes I have to think about the cycles of violence in 20th century Irish history, and certain parallels or similarities, but also some questions about when it comes to dealing with Irish counterinsurgency operations. This man's very interesting. He served, indeed, incidentally, there were some lieutenants in the British Army who served in places like Donegal and Cavan, who later crop up as in the 1970s in advising the Down Orange welfare, for example. There was an individual called Edward Burke, who was a second lieutenant in 1920, who then sort of leads a loyalist organisation in the 1970s. And there are a number of people still alive in the 70s who are talking to subsequent generations of officers about their experiences. And, so it's not completely lost knowledge of counterinsurgency in Ireland in the 20th century, from the 20s to the 70s. But what I really like about this quote is that when he was a captain, actually, at that time in County Mayo, and he says that, actually they were getting the level of violence right. Okay, so this is exemplary counterinsurgency. When I say exemplary counterinsurgency, I don't mean hearts and minds. I mean, you intimidate population, right? You intimidate them into acquiescence with your aims. But that doesn't mean that you carry out extreme, brutal acts against the population. You intimidate them to a certain level where they'll acquiesce, but not to a level whereby they will sort of withdraw all consent due to the sheer sort of magnitude of grievance that you've inflicted upon them. So what he's trying to make here is a subtle point, in that when the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, who were one of the case studies that I looked at in the 1970s, when they were in Mayo and Galway in the 1920s, actually, they felt they did frighten the civilians, and that was the intent. But they didn't do it as much as the Black and Tans, right? Who sort of, from once Black and Tans came in and basically aggrieved the local population to that level, they lost then all their intelligence cycle. So it's an interesting quote because it's counterintuitive. You think, well, if you're intimidating people, so what the British Army, in terms of this sort of highlights the great tradition of exemplary counterinsurgency that was very common in the Empire, right up until the campaign in Dhofar in the early 1970s, where you'd use exemplary violence. For example, the sort of suspension of habeas corpus, the sort of forced villagization, the removal of populations, or perhaps the burning of crops, or reprisal operations that were quite common in the 20th century. But obviously, by the 1970s, within the United Kingdom, this was sort of past policy, exemplary counterinsurgency, officially. The idea that you couldn't do clearly what you did in the 1920s in Ireland, and you certainly couldn't do in the United Kingdom what you could do in Dhofar in Oman in the 1970s. So there's a clear, it's a new phase, and it's a different United Kingdom, and it's a different military approach. But nonetheless, in terms of sort of levels of violence, or to what degree you can kind of perhaps even intimidate the population into acquiescence, that informally has not gone away from the thinking of some of the British Army, some of the British Army who have experienced colonial counterinsurgency operations in the 50s and 60s in Malaya and Borneo, in Radfan in Yemen, etc. And so they know they're in a different conflict in the 1970s, but they're still reaching back a little bit sometimes to past experiences, past templates, and sometimes quite wistfully thinking, if we were in Kenya, if we were in Cyprus, we could have done this. So there is a clear difference in terms of counterinsurgency operations or internal security or counter-terrorism operations in the United Kingdom to the colonial setting, which we should remember. There is no clear sort of continuation, but nonetheless, as I want to talk about is, officially it's finished, but informally some officers and some small units occasionally still reach for certain templates of violence that they've experienced previously, and that can be problematic. So first, there are four main contributions that I want to make today. The first is that in terms of why I sort of approach this research and why sort of and what I want to argue is that, well, there's a relative dearth of literature compared to terrorism studies in terms of looking at the major counter-terrorism or counterinsurgency actor in the 1970s, particularly the British Army. And I'd say even the RUC is not as well covered as it possibly should be. Also, the cultural perceptions of people from GB when they came over here have not really been sort of studied in enough depth. You know, how, for example, if you're a squaddie from Liverpool, how do you sort of relate to being in Belfast? Or if you're just somebody from the Gloucesters, with no real sort of, you know, connection, or not a huge connection with Ireland, or you're from the Devon and Dorsets, how do you then sort of culturally engage with Northern Ireland? Is it different to the people from Liverpool or Glasgow, or is it the same? So a lot of that cultural studies is not really, we're only scratching the surface yet. I think there's a huge amount more to be done for future historians, or even, you know, there's a little bit of touch of multidisciplinary aspect to this. This is, you know, touching on anthropology, sociology. This is interesting in terms of looking at how groups orientate themselves, and what cultural frames they sort of establish when they go to a new place within their same country, United Kingdom, and then sort of, you know, try and make sense of it all. And I'd also say that, you know, in terms of the small unit cohesion, well, you know, it's funny, the Israelis have often lamented that, you know, in the UK and you know, UK and Irish scholars have not really focused on Northern Ireland in terms of small unit culture, right? They, for some reason, they've done a huge amount in terms of, you know, the Israeli, the IDF in the West Bank or Gaza or Lebanon, masses and masses of papers in terms of, you know, things like deviance, crime, you know, in terms of military crime, and there's very little actually done in the United Kingdom and Ireland. And that's various reasons for that. You know, the IDF is sort of very much embedded in Israeli society. It's a conscript army, right? So everybody, you know, spends a time in it. Whereas obviously in a professional, sort of in a very small military, relatively speaking, the population that we have in the UK, then, you know, you tend to have sort of academia sits over here sometimes, and PME is a little bit, you know, so kind of military education is seen as a little bit over there, and very much the military sit over here, right? So there's not as much fluidity in terms of the UK, in terms of the academia and the military sometimes, which leads to then that, you know, anthropologists and sociologists are very sort of slightly detached and wary then of approaching looking at the military. And then also, you know, there's some, in terms of the third element, I just thought that some of the excellent material that is out there, I still sort of question, you know, some of the conclusions. Aaron Edwards has written many, you know, Queen's graduate, many fine studies of the British Army in Northern Ireland. And it said that, you know, the army was quick to admit its mistakes in the 1970s. I don't agree with that. I actually think the senior officers were relatively slow to learn, actually, and in a lot of denial when it came to sort of criminality or sort of deviant behaviour. And then people like Fionnuala Ní Aoláin as well, you know, talks about automism of crime. So that basically that she talks about sort of, you know, set-piece military death or murder, right? So that basically the military, the soldiers are unthinking because they're trained in a certain way to kill. They will simply, if put in a certain position, pull the trigger. That doesn't resonate with what I found in terms of soldiers kind of their autonomy, their agency, and how diverse, you know, their reactions can sometimes be. But by and large, sort of, you know, they tend to stick to, you know, the yellow card. The rules of engagement are important to them. And they also they exercise agency. They, you know, sometimes in complex situations, some of them can react in slightly different ways. Again, often depending on the kind of the small group or unit to which they belong, and how they see the situation they're in. And then finally, deviance. Now, what do I mean by deviance? Well, I think Pascal Vennesson, the French scholar who looked at the French military in West Africa, has come up with a very, very good definition of deviant cohesion. He calls it, deviant cohesion supports operational goals at the tactical and operational level, but contradicts the self-identity promoted by the army as a whole and has negative strategic and political consequences. So the guys at sort of, you know, at the ground level, guys sort of in the operation think that in the small unit think they're doing their service for their mates, for their subunit, for their company, or for their battalion or regiment, but actually contradicts them, as I say, as Vennesson says, contradicts the values, the rules that of the wider institution, and can be politically damaging, therefore. And I think also when you look at deviance, and, you know, a lot of military sort of get upset when I talk about this, because they say, well, I think you should look sometimes at you know, studies of gangs, right? Because actually, when things go wrong in the army, sometimes, you know, small groups of soldiers, if they're deviant, can come to resemble gangs, right? And that's the difference between adhering to the rule of law and the application of violence, and not. So Ruth Horowitz, who's looked at the study of gangs in Chicago, talks about how, the legends and stories shared by gang members about their participation in violence set the moral parameters for that violence, right? So what's wrong, what's right, you have to, sort of in terms of their code, right? And if you're sort of not, if for whatever reason you're no longer adhering to the rules, then you've set your own conditions for what's acceptable in terms of the use of violence. Then sometimes looking actually at gang warfare is quite useful. Michael Ignatieff has talked about how in static counterinsurgency, IDF, Northern Ireland, that actually all conflict is local, right? And some to an extent, the kind of the literature on the other side sort of backs this up. Jerry Adams talks about 1970, 71. All I could think about was Ballymurphy. That was my world, And if you're sort of in a small group of soldiers and your only task is to sort of dominate 4 streets, that's your world, right? So it's kind of very local. You're not moving anywhere. There's no battalion you're not going to move around in battalion type operations of 700 men. You're going to do small static operations, quick or snatch squads, quick. Sort of you'll have a lot of period of boredom where you're simply just doing vehicle checkpoints, or you're simply just doing stuff that is rather routine, but you get to know the area quite well, and sometimes you get to know the inhabitants quite well as well, and then that can be problematic in that if the population are seen as universally hostile to you or just not cooperative, and your mates are dying, you're shot by an unseen enemy, etc., or blown up in a bomb. Then your grievances against the local population, can become important triggers for group deviancy. It's a very challenging form of warfare, very low intensity in terms of kinetic activity, but challenging. And I suppose, in other words, to paraphrase Clausewitz, such personalized micro wars kind of develop their own local grammar, right? So, and that comes out of soldiers' accounts of going back to the Cregan for the 4th time, 1976. Having lost 8 soldiers there in the previous 3 years and have 55 casualties, right? Very high numbers of casualties, some of these units, right? So in terms of, we need to, and I think that also that, in terms of trying to talk to, sometimes have these conversations about the army, we tend to like to see, as a state, as any state, you tend to like to see the army as a forensic instrument, right? It's a scientific application of force. What we, it's sort of, their work is supposed to be a science, and soldiers should always use violence professionally according to cold calculations. That's how we like to see it, right? But sometimes, there is, in terms of the emotions, in terms of the feelings of loss, pain, grievance, these are more subjective elements of being in the military, and they're important ones. But sometimes, in terms of dealing with them, especially when a military crime has happened, the easiest recourse, as Arella Graziani, the Israeli anthropologist who's attached to the Israeli military for a long time, serving in the Israeli military, says, by and large, it's often easier to say that is a rotten apple. That is an individual just an individual, or 2 individuals maybe, who violated, or 3, but this does not reflect anything about the wider institution. Now that takes the individual away from potentially the group dynamics that formed that individual, that may have led to that individual being in that place, and it may have actually established a lot of the moral code that an individual may or may not have may not have been important to that individual at that time. So, so that's essentially sort of that's the 4 areas that I thought were worthy of study and then informed the book. But think about I sort of then burrowed right down, because if you're going to really understand how small units operate, then you need to literally know a lot of people in a small unit and talk to a lot of people who have served in that unit. So what I did was, because I had spent time working with several regiments in Afghanistan, I basically, and I had a lot of people who would a lot younger than this generation, but who'd served. I sort of and then I went to the queue and I spent a week in the archives looking through various War Office files in terms of you now have all the battalion logbooks for certain regiments, all the watchkeepers' logs, all the intelligence summaries. Some of them had closed again, but a lot of them were available around 7 years ago. And so I kind of looked at, and what I wanted to do was narrow down which regiments were particularly interesting, and how could I couldn't do the whole, let's be honest, there's a lot more to do in the army. I couldn't do the whole army in terms of a small unit study. It would take 100 years, right, to possibly sort of try and look at every single infantry alone regiment. Our infantry battalion had served in that period, in a particularly violent period, 1971 to 1973, when counterinsurgency, when the IRA was fielding units in the streets of Belfast and on the border, in terms of sometimes getting into sustained firefights of up to 4 or 5 hours long, something they didn't do in the 90s, which is when the British Army tends to, when it goes to Iraq, takes its lessons from, not from the more confusing, chaotic very violent period of 1972 when they lost 134 soldiers, far more than any single year in Iraq or Afghanistan. So which regiments would I pick? Well, I needed to understand the social background of these individuals. I need to really get into who they were, right? Because obviously, if you're, it depends. The army makes you, but so does you're from somewhere too, right? You don't just come into the army age as a junior soldier, age 15, 16, or you very much are, 18, 19. You're formed also by your social background. You're conditioned by other identities, clearly. So what I had to do was to say that, well, look, I'm going to particularly look at the Scottish experience. Why Scotland? Well, because Scotland, the closeness interested me, right? That this was, if we're talking about, the Troubles being not only an Irish conflict, but also a British conflict, then and Scotland is about as close as it gets. And I wanted to look at infantry combat, basically combat experienced infantry units that had seen a lot of expeditionary warfare in the previous years. And so it had gained a reputation within for themselves, but also externally as being combat efficient, right? So, sharp end. So, and then second of all, I wanted to look at units that came under pressure, as opposed to units that didn't. And so, in terms of the case studies, the Scots Guards, took 55 casualties in 1971 in West Belfast, basically deployed around the area of the Springfield Road, Beachmount, parts of the Falls, Lower Falls. And 4 dead, 55 seriously wounded. Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders suffered 8 dead in their tour of between July 1972 until November 1972 in primarily an RUC-H division, so sort of South Down, South Armagh. So both these regiments and second Battalion Scots Guards served in Derry in 1972. From the same period, it's July 1972 until November 1972, and they had 4 fatalities and 30 wounded, and particularly all those fatalities sort of focused on pretty much one company, right flank in the Brandywell. So just a particularly small area where they're consistently attacked, allegedly by Martin McGuinness, particularly, who was leading a lot of those operations. So Scottish, combat effective. Took a lot of casualties. I had to have some ability to compare, right? So, our clear differences, though. Scots Guards are household division, right? So, Guards are socially elite, highly aristocratic in terms of the number of their officers, so related to the Queen, and in terms of they have a slightly different attitude then, sort of how they carry themselves. The Argyll's Highland Regiment saw themselves quite differently, in terms of having a particularly elevated reputation for being counterinsurgency fighters, right? So having had a lot of publicity because of Colonel Colin Mitchell, Mad Mitch, in Aden, served in Borneo, and sort of had cultivated a bit of a sort of Highland identity was very important to them. But most of them were really actually from the suburbs and Clydeside, kind of the area of Clydeside, so around Glasgow, not Glasgow itself. But Stirlingshire and all the way down then to parts of Ayrshire. So particularly heavily recruitment from the towns of Greenock and Paisley, where I spent quite a lot of time. I spent also quite a lot of time in Stirling Castle, because to its enormous credit, I made it quite clear from the start that I wasn't trying to eulogise, but I certainly wasn't trying to demonise. I was just trying to look at the human experience of these soldiers and try and understand their behaviour in terms of the wider unit, in terms of their full scope of their conduct. And to the credit of the Regimental Association, the Regimental Museum, at no point did they ever say, well, no, we don't like that, we don't trust that. They were incredibly generous with their time, with their access, and it was hugely appreciated. This is my study, it's not theirs, all right? So any mistakes, as I say in the book, anything they don't like, they can pin it on me. But to be fair to them, they didn't try and restrict historical research to only people they saw as just purely sympathetic, or purely would sort of, have a narrative that they completely approved of. They never put any restrictions on the research, and I hugely appreciate that. And I'm still in touch with a lot of them today. Some were happy with the book, others had their quibbles, but I'm in conversation with quite a large amount of them still. In terms of some of the conclusions then, or that I drew, well, I have four main arguments, and the first is that the company and its commander were often the key level of operational command in Northern Ireland. Why the company? Well, because again, it was no battalion-sized operation. So generally, 120 soldiers approximately makes up a company, and the major then, usually in the sort of early to mid 30s, sometimes late 30s, was the kind of guy. He was the reality constructor for the 18-year-old soldiers around him. They saw him every single day, and if they lost faith in the major, that was a problem, right? If they didn't think he was particularly competent, as happened in one of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders battalions, there was one company commander who they lost faith in, that sort of breakdown, certain amount of discipline. But if they weren't confident in him, that was a problem. And then sort of they would look for other leaders in other ways, sometimes informal leaders, a particularly charismatic sergeant perhaps, or somebody to replace him. But the major was very, very important. And the local civilians knew it too. As anybody, including, my own family here would say, if my wife's family would say, everyone knew that the major was in charge of a certain area. So they would ask for the major. Where's the major, right? So in Belfast people got it too. And in terms of the, I would say that there was significant divergence then between the various subunits, various companies. So what we could see is, even as I go on to talk about it a little bit, is that within the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, for example, there was even a divergence between companies. So one company was quite restrained for various reasons, which I get into. Another was quite aggressive. To some degree dependent on the personality of the company commander himself, and how they positioned themselves. And the command and oversight of that, trying to ensure operational consistency, was not always as it should have been. So divergent behaviour confused the population, it could confuse the police. So for example, in the case of Newry with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in 1972, they said, Delta Company, we don't want to come in, support company anytime. Thirdly, I want to argue that it's a painful topic, but ultimately the demonisation of the Irish population had a utilitarian purpose. There was a reason for it. It's practical, right? You don't want to necessarily hurt people who are exactly like yourself, right? If they're too similar to you, it's difficult to do your job if your job is the application of violence. But trying to limit demonisation of the population is difficult too. So it's I'll go on to talk about just a little bit why that was the case. And actually, a lot of the soldiers saw a huge amount of similarities before they deployed between themselves and the Irish. The Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders is, between approximately between a half and a third of them that I interviewed had Irish backgrounds. Some Irish backgrounds. A third of them were Catholic. So contrary to the sort of orange label that's just been applied to the Argylls and other Scottish regiments, there's more complexity there actually in terms of who they were that we need to examine. And finally, which I probably don't have time to get into very much, I'll just say that the combat and training worked in terms of when they got into firefights, generally they won them reasonably straightforwardly, and the IRA kind of realised this quite quickly, and you couldn't take a lot of casualties after 71, 72 when it's kind of recruiting dropped off, and so they stopped engaging in these sustained firefights, particularly in the border. But basically sort of both at the small platoon or section level, 8 soldiers, or half section, 4 soldiers, generally junior NCO leadership was particularly good, and you can see that in sort of the logbooks that you can look at in terms of sort of how they advanced. They used different tactics, fire and manoeuvre very well to kind of outflank the IRA in various, including in South Armagh, contrary to kind of sometimes mythology of, when they got in a firefight, they tend to come out on top. In terms of, and that's unsurprising, they're professional soldiers, right? That's what they do all the time. So in terms of looking, so unit autonomy, I would say that was a significant element. And if you look at, again, as I talked about this kind of tension between certain officers who served elsewhere and then trying to adjust to sort of counterinsurgency in the UK, some of them just struggled, and some decided to kind of do it their way. So, for example, Major Martin Smith, who went on to be a senior officer, wrote in his memoirs that when he was in Ardoyne in the summer and autumn of 1973, he said, "When we took over from the parachute battalion, it was too dangerous to drive down the Old Park Road in Belfast. We could only patrol on foot. I never allowed more than 4 Irishmen to group together. At night, I switched off all street lights with the master key so the IRA couldn't see us, but they had a key too, so switched them on to set up ambushes for us. I twice shot out the lights just as we shot at petrol bombers. I was known as the Reverend Bastard." Right, so Smith used to kind of systematically, so if anybody used the house as a sniping position, he would destroy the house. He'd get the Royal Engineers in, and he'd say, "There's something buried." He'd find an excuse to knock the house down, right? And he'd dig up the garden, because that was a way of just showing others that, a bit like Brigadier Anderson, That was a way of showing the others that, look, if you do this, if you allow your house to be used in this way, I will punish you. It's not official. It's not, you won't find anything in sort of MOD archives about this, but that's very much how he governed the Ardóin, right? He was the man in charge. And, he said technically all this would be dressed up as merely, a legitimate search, but the locals soon got the message. Now, the Ardóin is interesting because actually, later in the year, the Royal Regiment of Wales comes to the Ardóin, and they scare the hell out of the local IRA unit because they're seen as being far, far too nice. And so some of the IRA newspapers for the Ardóin are very interesting to look at because they go, this Welsh regiment has come in and they're trying tricks, but don't forget when the burnings happened, who protected you? We protected you. So don't believe these Welsh guys. Don't believe them when they tell you they're different when they're doing things. So they've spent a lot of time putting out pamphlets to the local population saying the Royal Regiment of Wales are really what they're trying to do is do mobile patrols. So they're not trying to dominate physically all the streets. They're looking, and they're not trying to get in fights with teenagers. They're trying to identify using the royal signals who exactly is commanding that area in terms of the IRA side. So they're trying to use intelligence tactics. They're a little bit more sort of longer thinking than the sort of just physical dominance of the area. They're trying to basically use things like helicopters to try and sort of forensically pick out leaders in the Ardóin, not simply just fight the local teenagers. So it's a different approach, and it worries the IRA. Completely different to the Grenadier Guards. In terms of illustrative of that physical dominance, that sort of need of young, late adolescents, 18-year-olds, by and large, that's most soldiers are sort of late teenagers, early 20s. In terms of their sort of need sometimes to dominate a patch or physically dominate, you have to remember a lot of these guys are training for conventional warfare all the time. And they're also kind of used to, very much establishing a myth and reality of physical dominance. So when there are other, armed men in an area, they don't tend to take it too well, by and large, no matter who they are. So what we see is consistently in Derry between 1971 and 1973 are major confrontations with the United States Navy. Right, so the U.S. Navy is seen as really despised because they have naval communications station in Derry and Dungiven, and they are really despised by various British Army units because, well, they're pretty well paid. They get a lot of the girls. They marry a lot of these. Derry being a predominantly Catholic city, of course. They marry a lot of the local women, and what you see is these sort of fights break out all the time. And the British Army, various British Army units, including the Scots Guards, 2 Scots Guards, report that the U.S. Navy are helping the IRA. So that's in their intelligence summaries. They're actually right. Okay, there are a number of because I interviewed the U.S. Navy sailors about this, and a number of them told me that yes, they had been. One of them said yes, we had a meeting with Martin McGuinness. I offered to be his driver. Another admitted that sort of he was a driver, but McGuinness apparently sort of pushed back on this. So a number of U.S. Navy sailors were very sympathetic to the Catholic population of Derry and wanted to do something about it. Now, again, that's not all of them. We're talking a handful of individuals. There was also one U.S. Navy sailor who allegedly, according to other sailors, but it was allegedly was close to the UDA in Derry. And in fact, there was a bomb attack on Dungiven, on the U.S. Navy mast in Dungiven, right, which was allegedly loyalists who did that because they were so annoyed of the IRA sympathies of the U.S. Navy. So it was quite interesting. Is that you just get this micro war between the U.S. Navy and the British Army going on in the streets of Derry at various points. And there's something instinctive about territory there, and possibly women, and possibly other things, right? That we are going to dominate this patch, and you can't sort of waltz around here with your good teeth and your Hershey bars, because we own this patch. We are the physically dominant company here, and it's very embarrassing to the U.S. government and to the British government that this is happening, but it does happen. And of course, what's often overlooked is the sustained fights between British Army companies, particularly, or battalions as well, with Ulster loyalists during this period too. And so loyalists, if you look at, for example, the 18th of October 1972, when loyalist leaders met with the General Officer Commanding, General Harry Tuzo, and they demanded that the 1st Battalion Parachute Regiment be withdrawn from Northern Ireland. Right, the powers had to go, according to the UVF. Because of the shooting, because essentially, they said that these guys are just, they've decided they got in a dispute with some loyalist paramilitaries. It escalated, and then the Paras killed two allegedly innocent bystanders, including Robert Johnston, who was drunk, barefoot, and was wandering up the street and was shot dead. The last words he was heard to say was, "I run about in my feet 30 years ago, the weak shall inherit the earth," and then he was shot. And so they begged that, they asked the GOC to take the Paras immediately out of West Belfast. And then in 1976, the Argyll and Sullivan Highlanders also end up in having a major clash with the UDA and actually the UVF as well, but particularly the UDA. They confiscated money from UDA clubs, and then later the soldiers rioted in Royal Avenue and sold some stuff from jewellery shops. And the loyalist leader Hughie Smith condemned them as a criminal syndicate. Considering he was close to the UVF, the soldiers didn't take that too well. But nonetheless, there was a sustained problem in terms of, again, the physical dominance of certain loyalist areas, and these fights that used to pretty frequently break out between, especially the player units, those units with a sort of more combat hardened reputation, which they wanted to preserve, and they were not going to accept loyalist checkpoints or anything like that nonsense, and they certainly weren't going to take as far as they were concerned. A lot of this stuff is going on, and it's something quite complex. It's not the simple, some of the simplistic narratives we have about the British Army here are not. This is about territory, and this it also sort of means that when various sides try to politically co-opt or sort of cast the Scottish, like the Argylls, as just simply another orange ally, it's much more complicated than that, and it's much more interesting. So revenge was a critical motivation, and what we see is that at various points, depending on the unit, they behave quite differently. For whatever reason, when the 1st Battalion Scots Guards come into West Belfast Ballymurphy in late August 1971, after the Ballymurphy, the massacre, the inquest that's now going on, they tone down completely their operations, what they do. Their fire discipline is exemplary. I mean, in terms of, they clean up, their NCOs issue reports that they seized Buckshee ammunition. Now, Buckshee ammunition is illegally held ammunition held by other units, which have been passed to them, which they report right up to the top, because they're guards, NCOs, or sergeants, and they sort of do things very much by the book in their view, right? So they're sort of quite, there's a different attitude comes into Ballymurphy. I think it's quite fortunate, actually, because things are red hot around Henry Taggart Hall at that stage. They take a lot of casualties, but actually they behave, they start doing the right flank, which is the company in Ballymurphy, stop doing foot patrols for a while just to let things cool down. Now, there's other units. To be honest, I don't think the 1st Battalion, the Departure Regiment, would have done that, right? So it's a very different. Again, that was very much. It was a local decision by a local major who made that decision to do that. Nobody told him to. He just decided to do it. So there's a lot of autonomy here. But when it comes to, and even though there's a real desire for revenge in the 1st Battalion Scots Guards, and there are some incidents that I can certainly, there are punitive acts, certainly, but at the same time, by and large, they sort of maintain their discipline. What's interesting too is that the artillery regiments at this time are very much welcomed by the police. Now, the artillery regiments are basically guys who like polishing their guns in Woolwich, right, or somewhere else. They're a sort of technical part of the British Army, so they're not interested in being particularly tough. They really like the guns, right? And so when they come to Northern Ireland in an infantry role, which they hate, they're not trying to prove anything, really. They're not trying to dominate anything. They kind of just want to go home, but they do tend to get on very well with local defence committees, or they tend to negotiate access, and they tend to talk to local priests and they get on reasonably well with CESA, the Catholic Ex-Servicemen's Association. There's various artillery units that seem to kind of have a toned down attitude. And so, whereas if you look at, the infantry units, the regular infantry units, they tend to not take so well to this negotiation, just kind of give, talking to Catholic Ex-Servicemen's Association, who are they? We're the Royal Scots, we're just going to go in and just tell you how it's done. Right? That's how this works. As the CEO of the Royal Scots said, this is the Queen's Highway when he's talking about the Falls Road. That's it. No negotiation, right? So, my point is that you get, so again, just underlining the point that this is divergent. It's hard to explain. You've got a top-down institution, hierarchy, norms, strategy, rules of engagement, and they're all there, and there's quite a lot of different behaviour going on, which is confusing. And again, you'll see that replicated in how the police sometimes sort of talk about various different rotating units. And the police are often warned to say, oh no, it's last week syndrome. So whenever they're doing their 4-1 tours, the roulement battalions, the police are talking about the last week is when, sometimes unfortunately, various regiments try and get even. So they get a bit, there's a bite to their behaviour. So revenge was a critical motivation. And if we don't take revenge, if we need to look at how the need for revenge came about and how that led to mistakes and criminality. So if we think about, got around 10 minutes? Yeah. So if we think about where this comes from, well, in 1970-71, there's a lot of fraternisation going on with the local population. The soldiers go to pubs, it's not particularly violent. The IRA campaign is really to kick off, and a lot of them, quite a number of them have girlfriends, right, in Northern Ireland. A number of them marry, Northern Irish girls, as we know. But that shifts then, obviously, after things like Ballymurphy. And what you see then is this kind of, soldiers talk a lot about being lepers, right? Basically sort of increasingly isolated from the local population. And there's one really illustrative incident in South Armagh where, the soldiers, first Battalion Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders D Company, when they first arrive, they keep going to the same farmhouse in Glasdrumman, and the McComiskey farmhouse. And there they sort of get tea and sandwiches, and there's a beautiful 19-year-old girl there called Nancy McComiskey, who one soldier said is like a beautiful island in a rough sea. Every time they just loved her. They thought she was beautiful, right? So they weren't doing anything untoward. They were very polite, but this was the only thing at sort of 10 o'clock at night that kept them going in sort of this dark, these difficult times of July, August 1972. Nancy McComiskey in August 1972, late August, was when her family went to Mass in Glasdrumman, was dragged from her family car and tied to the church railing and tarred and feathered, right? And then soldiers suddenly realised, like, wow, well, we can't have contact with the local population. This is too dangerous for them now. This is what happens, right, when we do this. So, but the isolation is damaging. If you feel you're 18 years old, 19, and you're a leper, it's not a good feeling in terms of, why these people spit on me, why they sort of, there's a lot of, any black soldier, there's consistent evidence of racial abuse of black soldiers. The Derry Volunteer newspaper publishes an article about banana munchers advising black soldiers to find a tree to hide in. So if you're a black mate, that's the type of stuff you'll get, right, soldier, and there's a lot of black soldiers in the British Army. And so in response, they sort of begin to demonise the Catholic population as somehow dirty or savage, and they sort of increasingly emphasise a moral distance from themselves. Now, I didn't really find evidence, to be honest, the anti-Irish thing was much more common than the sort of than the sectarian language, even in Scottish Highland regiments. And again, it's important to remember that a third of the Argylls are Catholics. So if you want, your mate to have your back, you better not sort of, use sectarian language, because he's a Catholic, and you want to sort of, his job is to keep you safe, and he's your mate, right? So, and what we generally find is that there are some sectarian baiting. There is some sectarian language, but by and large, it's anti-Irish. Right? So they can agree. Even Scots who have Irish heritage can agree they're Scots, and they have to say something. So the anti-Irish thing was kind of easier than the anti-Catholic thing. It's more common. And some soldiers, you do see problems in terms of collectively sort of taking things out on the local population. But there is other behaviour too. I mean, 5 soldiers in 1st Battalion Scots Guards in 1971 shoot themselves in the foot. Now, that could just be a coincidence, or it could be something else, all right? But they're taking 55 casualties, right? So they're having a bad time, right? The likelihood of them getting shot is pretty much 1 in 10, okay, of them getting shot at that point, which is very high. So, but if you look at, there's some very honest correspondence between some officers who are thinking about, how they relate with the local population. And one of the most interesting ones is, this dialogue between Major Hugh Lockhart, who was an officer in 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, and with Bishop Edward Daly, where he admits, he says that, Hearts and Minds was fine rhetoric, but a hard sell. He says, one of the main problems of changing patrol policy to a softer approach is the bitterness that exists. As you said, the people have no confidence in the army after 4 years, but our soldiers are equally bitter after several years of stoning, shootings and constant rebuffs, and it'll be a hard task to convince and inspire them to put into practice on the ground a hearts and minds policy which we at command level agree is correct. Daly was pretty cross with he was pretty angry with the Grenadier Guards because he believed that they were collectively punishing the Cregan. And Lieutenant General Frank King, who was the GOC at the time, looked into this incident, and he said that ultimately responded to Bishop Edward Daly, and he said, ultimately the inhabitants of the Cregan were to blame. They knew who the gunmen were, and they could have thrown them out. Right. So basically, because they were not revealing to the RUC or the army who the gunmen were, they were guilty. Right. So they can't really complain in that sense. According to King, this is a tainted area. Right, where basically the population are complicit. And so I think what we see is that inexcusable behaviour sometimes was excused on the basis that victims were somehow at fault, right? Just you lived in the Cregan, right? You're a bad area, it's bad. So you were allowed. And even when an incident where, General Tuzo was GOC in 1972, he admitted that something undeniably wrong had taken place. The abduction and severe beating of 2 Legion of Mary workers, Raymond Muldoon and Francis Craig, by soldiers from one para on 3rd of February 1972. Tuzo's wrath very much focused on the victims. He said Muldoon and Craig did not seek Army or RUC assistance to investigate their allegations. One is forced to the conclusion that they are more interested in propaganda than in the redress of the grievance. Now, for guys who lived in Beachmount, popping down to the local RUC station to make a complaint was a little bit tricky. Going to the army, well, they'd just been kidnapped by the army for a period of hours, at which point they were handed over to loyalist paramilitaries in the Shankill, who refused to have them. And the Gloucesters rescued them, but the Gloucesters were beaten up by the Paras. And the Gloucesters made a complaint to the GOC. That's why it came to light, because the Gloucester commanding officer wasn't having this. And they called his soldiers crap hats and everything else, and he didn't like it, and he made a complaint. Now Tuzo admitted, yeah, it happened, but actually there's very little evidence of nobody people being punished. As far as he was concerned, there's no complaint, can't act on it. They didn't go to the police, didn't go to the army, so they're interested in IRA propaganda. So, unfortunately, this is, archival material, and what it lends to then is a kind of conclusion that this is not common behavior. I'm not saying that this is widespread, but I'm saying that there is deviant behavior happening, and it is not being punished. So then what happens is we have divergence. And if we have divergence, we have confusion. And soldiers are confused about, what's permissible, what's not permissible. Is this there's some secret rules that we can abide by, or not. And by and large, it depended on the different battalion, the officers, the NCOs, as to whether they were, sticklers for the rules or not. There was some leeway for rule breaking. And in 1971, 1972. Now, why does that change? It does change. So at the end of 1972, William Whitelaw, who in my view is quite a far-sighted Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, appoints a director after direct rule, appointed a new DPP. And effectively, so before this, there was, according to the Royal Military Police, essentially a honeymoon period for the army. This is from a Royal Military Police major, with both the RMP and the RUC sympathetic towards a soldier who was, after all, doing an incredibly difficult job. He was highly unlikely to make a statement incriminating himself. For the RMP investigator was out for information for managerial, not criminal purposes. And using their strength of powers of discretion, it was equally unlikely the RUC would prefer charges against soldiers, except in the most extreme of circumstances. That stops after 1972. And I think what we do see is Barry Shaw and others and the RUC having a much more concerted effort to weed out army crime, right? So and relations with the army and the RUC are very difficult in parts of 1973 and 1974. And I have to say there's some very good RUC officers who go to great lengths to collect evidence of military criminality. That's not universal, but there are a number of officers who emerge with particular credit. And similarly for the RNP, it's a divergence of behaviour within the Royal Military Police as well, right? So again, we have to be quite nuanced about this. So I think that if we think about the need to take life in Northern Ireland, so let's just move quickly onto the combat operations. Sorry, Peter, I'm wandering over time here. Just in terms of the need to take life, and again, so we've got this kind of demonization of the Irish that's creeping in, this social separation, this kind of dangerous, potentially dangerous movement towards a sort of view of collective culpability. So do they find life then particularly easy to take in that context? Well, I should say that certainly there is a problem in terms of, so the IRA learned reasonably quickly in 1971-72 that they can't, sustained firefights with the army are a bad idea. So this kind of shoot and scoot thing becomes more common, and so does the use of what we now call improvised explosive devices or bombs. So what the army try and start doing sometimes is certain soldiers, there's a risk then that they look for replacement targets. And in the 1980s, the roof of St. Eugene's Cathedral has to be replaced, right? Because the soldiers had convinced there's a sniper in the tower of that cathedral. resonating with John Horne's work actually on Belgium in 1914. They sort of shoot. They basically sort of the roof is so riddled with bullets that, and according to Edward Daly, the bishop, there's and actually the soldiers themselves interviewed several officers who said no, there was nobody up there. But when you're being shot at in the dark and you don't know who it is, you look for a demonstrable target somewhere. There, up in the hill in Cregan, perfect target, right? They also begin to really suspect that the Legion of Mary, the Knights of Malta, that certain organisations are in cahoots with the IRA, right? That there's Knights of Malta field hospitals in Donegal. And so they do start sort of really suspecting these organisations. They're looking for replacements sometimes. Now that doesn't mean that they sort of, again, behave in any way as, broadly violently as in the colonies or anything like that. But it does, there is a sort of sometimes a bit of a uptick in perhaps a sort of negative attitudes. But what is interesting is that it doesn't, despite these negative attitudes, again, there's in a lot of units, and looking at there is exceptional deviance, but it is quite exceptional. And when it comes to the use of snipers, it's fascinating to read that the officer in charge of training snipers during the period says Ireland's a huge problem for them, because he says that ultimately. Let me find the quote here actually. He said, a separation of identity became a professional necessity between the British and the Irish. He said, I found the problem was to get the guys to shake off the view. Am I really right to be doing this between a W.H. Smith and a Marks and Spencer's? And meanwhile, seeing Granny pushing grandchild down the road in the pram. This makes a big difference. All the other places, wherever we had been, have been peasant countries, where you were in a different country, where natives are natives. Here they are not natives, they are your kith and kin. The topography is exactly as you recognise it at home, yet you have a rifle in your hands. You are faced with a situation and your first instinct is, this cannot be happening. And that takes training and time, and it made Ireland such a unique operation. And the logbooks do back that up, in terms of snipers being in a position where they miss from 50 yards. These are trained, these are exceptionally good shots, and they're missing, right? And they try and claim a hit afterwards. Oh, the Knights of Malta must have got him. But there is a problem the army recognised during this period in terms of taking life in cold kill situations. So that kind of idea that we have, sometimes we have images of the Troubles or Loughgall, or we have, and actually they're struggling, and that's why this officer is saying we needed to separate ourselves out a little bit from the Irish. Too many of us were Irish, or had Irish antecedents. We had a problem. And I think that's quite interesting and deserves more research, this social proximity between Northern Ireland and GB and Great Britain. So they don't, the difference, they learn difference, and difference sort of emerges once they start taking casualties very sharply. But I do think that, that there's something quite complicated here. I think, to conclude, I think that ultimately, revulsion at IRA tactics and errors such as, the Bloody Friday or the Newry Customs bombing meant that, the tide of Catholic opinion turns against, obviously, the IRA. The sort of recruiting sort of ebbs off, right? And the army get very good at royal signals and listening, sort of dominating, knowing everything that's going on in the streets of West Belfast, and ultimately, they get a grip on it. They begin to watch everything, and they look for what the Russians would call a compromat. So, an IRA man who's sleeping with another IRA man's wife, or, and they use these guys and recruit them as agents. But the problem with the deviant behavior is that this isn't, and there's not a lot of voluntary intelligence, right? It's not a lot of people just coming saying my community is under pressure, Beachmount or wherever, or Ballymurphy, and I want you, Major, to do something about it. Here's the information. They don't get a lot of walk-ins like that, and that's because that the damage has been done by not very many people, but enough to cause huge problems for decades afterwards in terms of a loss of faith and goodwill among a large section of the population. That means that they may be neutral, or they may be slightly sympathetic, they may be Irish nationalists, but these guys, they're just a player in this conflict, and I'm not giving information to them. And that is a loss. That's a major loss that the British Army suffer. So I would just, to finish, I'd say that deviancy and military crimes were too often ignored or dismissed, and two contradictory approaches were tolerated. This sort of front foot, aggressive and broadly punitive approach, which a minority of battalions practiced, and the other, which was based on restraint.